The wind swept across the flat fields of Nebraska on the morning of October 13th, 1998. It was harvest season, but the streets of the small town of Redfield were unusually quiet. The day began like any other, until neighbors noticed something strange at the corner of Maple Road. The old repair shop that belonged to David Miller, age 45, stood with its door hanging wide open. David's truck, a rusted blue Ford, was still parked in the driveway. Tools were scattered across the concrete floor inside, as if dropped in the middle of work. A wrench glistened in the sunlight, half covered in dust. By mid-morning, unease spread among the neighbors. David was known for starting his work early, and he never left his shop open overnight. One neighbor, Henry Collins, stepped inside and called out his name. The silence inside was heavy, broken only by the squeak of the shop's ceiling fan. No answer came. Henry made a call to the sheriff's office. Within minutes, Deputy Carl Dawson arrived on the scene. He scanned the workshop carefully. A chair lay overturned near the counter. A phone cord had been ripped from the wall. Papers were scattered across the desk, as though someone had searched them in haste. Deputy Dawson's instincts told him that this was no simple disappearance. He secured the area and radioed for backup. Soon, the sound of police sirens echoed down the quiet road. Officers began taping off the property, their boots crunching on the gravel as they entered the dimly lit shop. The absence of David Miller was already alarming. His tools, his truck, and his boots were all still there, but he was nowhere to be found. The strange order of the shop hinted at a struggle that no one had seen. Detectives would later say that this first sight, the abandoned garage with its eerie silence, set the tone for the entire investigation. Something violent had happened here, and time was already working against them. As the day wore on, officers prepared to search the nearby fields and question the townspeople. A mystery had taken root in Redfield, Nebraska, and began with the unsettling emptiness inside David Miller's shop. In the heart of rural Nebraska, where farming was a way of life, David Miller was a man everyone knew. At 45 years old, he had built his life around hard work, family, and the values of a small-town community. He was a mechanic by trade, the kind of man who could take apart a tractor engine in the morning and have it running again by sunset. Farmers relied on him when their equipment broke down in the middle of harvest. Truck drivers trusted him with their rigs before long hauls. For David, repairing machines was more than a business. It was his contribution to the lifeblood of Redfield. David ran his shop on Maple Road, just a short walk from his modest family home. The garage had peeling paint and a weathered sign, but inside it was filled with the tools of his trade. Carefully arranged in order, neighbors often said that he could fix anything, even with a bare minimum of parts. More than once, he stayed late into the night helping a farmer get a broken harvester back into the fields, refusing to take extra money for the effort. At home, David was a husband and a father. His wife, Karen Miller, described him as steady and dependable, though often quiet at the end of long days. They had been married for over 20 years, and together they raised 2 children, Ethan, 16, and Claire, 14. Ethan had inherited his father's interest in machines, often shadowing him in the shop, while Claire leaned more toward school and writing. Yet she admired her father's patience and the pride he took in his work. But behind his reliability, David carried burdens. Business in small towns was never easy. Farmers often struggled to pay on time, and David's shop ran on tight margins. He dreamed of expanding, of adding new equipment, and maybe hiring another mechanic, but finances never allowed it. Bills piled up, and some months the family barely broke even. Still, he never complained openly, choosing instead to carry the weight quietly. Those close to him noticed that David was a man of contrasts. He was strong and trustworthy, yet sometimes weighed down by pressure. He was generous with neighbors, even when generosity cut into his own income. He was dedicated to family, but the strain of money and work often left him exhausted. Despite it all, his reputation in Redfield was one of respect. People admired his work ethic and the way he stood by his commitments. In the small community, David was more than just a mechanic. He was the man who stopped to help stranded drivers on country roads. He was a neighbor who plowed another family's driveway after a snowstorm. He was a father who sat in the bleachers during Ethan's school games and clapped proudly when Claire read her essays aloud at community events. These memories, ordinary yet profound, were what defined him. That is why his disappearance shook the town so deeply. To lose David Miller was not only to lose a husband and father. It was to lose the man people turned to in times of need, the man whose quiet strength anchored a family and supported a community. His absence was not just noticed. It was felt in every corner of Redfield. The weight of his character made the mystery all the more haunting. A man like David did not simply vanish. Something had torn him away from the life he had built, and the truth of that night would leave the community reeling for decades. The image of his open shop and abandoned tools now stood in sharp contrast to the life he had lived. Steady, dependable, and rooted in family and service. And that contrast made the unanswered questions even darker. The night of October 12, 1998, began like any other for David Miller. He spent the day repairing a tractor that a farmer urgently needed for harvest. By late evening, the sound of clinking tools echoed from the garage, spilling into the cool Nebraska air. The sun had set hours earlier, and the town of Redfield was winding down for the night. At approximately 9:30 p.m., a neighbor, Helen Jacobs, drove past the shop and saw David closing up. The lights inside were still on, and his familiar blue truck was parked in its usual spot. Nothing seemed unusual at first, but Helen later admitted she heard the muffled sound of raised voices near the garage. She slowed her car, uncertain, but then dismissed it. In a small town, arguments were not uncommon, and she thought little of it as she drove away. That brief moment would later haunt her. By morning, everything had changed. When Karen Miller awoke at dawn, she expected to find David getting ready for work. Instead, the house was silent. His side of the bed was untouched, and his boots were missing. Karen assumed he had gone to the shop early, but when she walked across the yard, what she saw made her stomach twist. The shop door was ajar, swinging slightly in the morning wind. Tools lay scattered across the concrete floor, as if dropped in haste. Near the counter, a metal chair had toppled onto its side. The phone, normally mounted on the wall, dangled by its cord, ripped loose. David's work boots, caked with mud from the fields, sat abandoned near the entrance. Karen called out his name, but the only response was the echo of her own voice. Panic surged. She rushed back to the house and dialed the sheriff's office. Deputy Carl Dawson arrived first. He took one look at the scene and knew this was not a simple case of someone walking away. He carefully stepped to the clutter, noting the overturned chair, the scattered papers, and the absence of blood. It looked like a struggle, yet strangely incomplete, as though whatever had happened had ended too quickly. Within an hour, detectives Mark Jensen and Lisa Rodriguez were dispatched. They photographed the garage, dusted for prints, and interviewed Karen. She explained that David never left without telling her where he was going. He was predictable, reliable, and deeply rooted in routine. For him to vanish overnight was unimaginable. Neighbors began to gather near the property, whispering among themselves. Helen Jacobs admitted she had heard arguing, but she could not identify the other voice. Another local, Tom Willis, reported seeing an unfamiliar pickup truck parked down the road late the night before. His memory was vague, and he could not provide a license plate, but it gave detectives a sliver of direction. The search widened quickly. Officers combed the fields behind the garage, flashlights sweeping through the tall grass. Dogs were brought in, but no scent trail carried far. The night's chill and strong winds had likely erased valuable traces. Inside the shop, investigators found David's wallet still tucked into his work jacket, along with a stack of unpaid bills on the desk. His keys remained on a hook near the doorway. Everything pointed to one fact. David had not planned to leave. As the hours passed, tension in Redfield grew heavier. The garage, once filled with the clang of tools and a hum of engines, now stood silent. Its open door a reminder of something violently interrupted. Detectives tried to piece together a timeline, but gaps remained. Who was the second voice heard that night? Why would anyone target David Miller, a man with no known enemies? The questions only deepened the mystery. By nightfall, investigators marked the shop as a crime scene. Yellow tape stretched across the property, and armed deputies stood guard. What began as a missing persons report was now officially treated as a suspicious disappearance. The unsettling silence that had lingered in the garage became the central image of the case, a hard-working man gone without explanation. His life left behind in fragments of scattered tools and broken order. The disappearance of David Miller was no longer just a family's private tragedy. It was the beginning of a case that would haunt Nebraska for decades. And as the first day ended, detectives could not shake the feeling that someone in town already knew the truth. The morning David Miller was reported missing, the sheriff's department wasted no time. A man like David did not simply vanish in a town where everybody knew each other's routines. Deputies sealed off the shop, took photographs of the scattered tools, and carefully noted the overturned chair and the ripped phone cord. It was immediately treated as suspicious, and the search for answers began. Detective Mark Jensen, a seasoned investigator with 20 years of experience, was assigned as lead. At his side was Detective Lisa Rodriguez, younger but sharp, known for her meticulous attention to detail. Together, they formed the small task force that would try to uncover what happened on that October night. Their first step was the family. Karen Miller sat at her kitchen table, her voice trembling as she repeated the same words. David would never leave us. He was supposed to fix a combine this weekend. He had plans. She described her husband as reliable to the point of routine, a man who woke before dawn, worked until light was gone, and always returned home. To her, the idea that he had walked away was unthinkable. Detectives then spoke to Ethan and Claire. Both children were shaken, their answers brief. Ethan recalled his father coming in around dinner time, washing up, and returning to shop after a quick meal. Claire remembered hearing the garage door roll shut later that evening. Neither child had heard the sound of arguing, but both noticed their mother pacing nervously when David did not return. Neighbors added more pieces to the puzzle. One man who lived across the dirt road claimed he heard Ray's voices near the shop shortly after 9 o'clock. He thought it was unusual, but not alarming. People often stopped by to ask David about repairs. Still, the words carried anger. He could not make out what was said, but the tone stuck with him. By morning, the memory carried a much heavier weight. Attention turned quickly toward rumors. In a town where word spread faster than the wind across cornfields, speculation took root. Some whispered about an unsettled debt. A farmer named Jack Turner had reportedly argued with David Weeks before over a tractor engine that never worked as promised. Others recalled a heated discussion with a man from the next county, unpaid bills piling between them. For detectives, every rumor had to be tested, every name written down, but evidence was scarce. The shop floor held no clear signs of blood, no fingerprints beyond David's own, and no trace of where he might have gone. His truck remained in the driveway. His wallet and keys sat untouched inside the house. Everything suggested that he had been interrupted in his work, and whatever happened afterward was swift. Detectives Jensen and Rodriguez organized a search. Volunteers combed through nearby fields, and deputies checked abandoned barns that dotted the countryside. Boats were sent into the Platte River, dragging hooks across the muddy bottom. Each day ended the same, empty-handed, with the silence of unanswered questions pressing heavier on the team. The lack of progress began to show. Small-town resources were thin. The sheriff's office had only a handful of deputies, most of whom were juggling daily calls while also trying to support the investigation. Jensen pushed for overtime hours. Rodriguez spent nights reviewing statements, searching for inconsistencies. Still, the case seemed to slip further away. Meanwhile, gossip only grew. Some residents whispered that David had secret troubles, debts larger than anyone knew. Others insisted it had to be an outsider. No one in their community could harm a man like David. The divide deepened tension, and suspicion settled over the town. People began locking their doors earlier, watching the road with unease. Inside the department, pressure mounted. Reporters called daily, demanding updates. The sheriff wanted results. But Jensen and Rodriguez had little more than fragments. A missing man, a night of raised voices, and a shop that stood as silent testimony to a struggle unseen. As the days passed, hope of finding David alive began to dim. though no one dared say it aloud. Every lead seemed ready to collapse. Every rumor dissolved under scrutiny. The investigators knew they were missing something, something hidden in plain sight, something waiting to be uncovered. And with each passing day, the shadows around David Miller's disappearance grew darker, hinting that the truth, when it came, would be far more disturbing than anyone imagined. The shock of David Miller's disappearance rippled quickly through the town. In a farming community where every tractor, harvester, and truck had once passed through his capable hands, the silence of his empty garage was impossible to ignore. For many, David was more than a mechanic. He was a lifeline. When word spread that he had vanished, disbelief was the first reaction. Fear came next. Farmers who relied on him gathered at the diner, shaking their heads over coffee. They spoke of engines that would now remain idle, of harvest slowed without David's quick fixes. To them, his absence was not only a personal tragedy, but a practical crisis. He was always there when something broke, one farmer muttered. Now the whole town feels broken. At the church, the congregation organized prayer vigils. Candles flickered as hymns filled the air, voices rising with desperation. Neighbors bowed their heads, asking for David's safe return, asking for strength for his family. For the first time in years, pews overflowed. People who rarely attended services now came, seeking comfort in collective grief. The missing man had brought the community together, but beneath the prayers lay a gnawing unease. Inside the Miller household, the struggle was even heavier. Karen Miller did her best to hold the family together, but cracks began to show. She spent sleepless nights waiting by the phone, her eyes red from exhaustion. When detectives failed to bring new answers, her patience frayed. She clashed with officers, insisting they search harder, accusing them of giving up too soon. He is out there, she told them firmly, and you need to find him. For Ethan, the burden manifested in silence. Once a steady student, he began skipping school, wandering the edges of town as if searching for his father himself. Teachers noticed his empty desk, his drifting focus when he did appear. Anger simmered beneath his quiet demeanor, and friends whispered that he had gotten into fights. Losing his father without explanation had left him adrift, a boy forced to carry a man's grief. Claire's grief took a different form. Each night, she sat at her desk and wrote letters to her father, pages filled with questions, with love, with pleas for him to come home. She tucked them into a shoebox beneath her bed, believing somehow he might read them one day. Her words were both a cry for comfort and a fragile thread of hope. Friends of the family spoke of the hollow feeling that now lingered in David's garage. Once alive with the clatter of tools and his warm laughter, it now stood cold and silent. The unfinished repairs, the half-assembled engine parts. Everything was frozen in time, waiting for a man who never returned. For many, walking past the shop was a painful reminder that something vital had been ripped away. As weeks turned into months, unity began to shift into frustration. At first, neighbors rallied around the Millers, bringing meals, offering rides, keeping vigil. But with each fruitless search and each unanswered question, whispers grew sharper. Some accused law enforcement of incompetence. Others wondered if Karen knew more than she admitted. Tension fractured the small-town harmony, exposing divisions where once there had been solidarity. What had started as shared grief was now laced with suspicion and fatigue. And through it all, the question lingered in every corner town. How could a man so deeply woven into the life of his community vanish without a trace? The search for answers moved quickly at first, but momentum began to falter as each promising lead dissolved into disappointment. Detectives Mark Jensen and Lisa Rodriguez felt the weight of every tip phoned into the station, every rumor whispered at the diner, every anxious glance from townspeople waiting for news. What seemed at first like a case on the verge of breaking open was slipping into something far more complicated. The first major lead came when deputies picked up a drifter on the outskirts of town. He had been spotted wearing a jacket that belonged unmistakably to David Miller. Hope surged. For a brief moment, Whispers spread to the community that maybe the man had harmed David and kept his belongings as trophies. Detectives pressed the suspect hard in the interrogation room, asking where he had gotten the jacket. His story was ragged but consistent. He had pulled it from a donation bin behind a church in the next county. At first, the claim sounded too convenient, but an officer confirmed the bin was indeed used by locals, and David's wife reluctantly admitted she had sent old clothes earlier that summer. The jacket, once a symbol of hope, turned out to be nothing more than a discarded piece of the past. The drifter was released, and the investigation returned to square one. Soon after, attention shifted to a man named Carl Donovan, a fellow mechanic who operated a small repair shop just outside of town. Rumors swirled that Carl and David had clashed over clients and unpaid repair bills. Tensions between them had been visible, and some believed Carl might have snapped under financial pressure. Detectives considered the possibility of business rivalry escalating into violence. They dug into Carl's background, tracing his movements on the night of October 12th. For several days, the town buzzed with speculation that the rival mechanic was the culprit, but Carl's alibi held. Records showed he had been in Omaha that evening, attending a parts trade meeting. Witnesses placed him at the event, and hotel receipts confirmed his stay. Disappointment echoed through the precinct. Another suspect cleared. Another door slammed shut. The third lead came not from evidence but from gossip. Some townspeople whispered that David might not have been the victim of foul play at all. Instead, they suggested he had run away. Stories surfaced of financial stress, of debts hidden from his family, of a man who might have wanted to start over elsewhere. Detectives had to chase down every possibility, even the uncomfortable ones. They combed through bank records, questioned co-workers, and searched for signs of hidden accounts or unusual withdrawals. Nothing emerged. David's finances were tight, but not suspicious. His bank cards had not been used after his disappearance, and no secret plans appeared in his records. The theory of him abandoning his family collapsed under the weight of evidence. Each time detectives felt close to a breakthrough, the ground fell out beneath them. False leads drained resources, hours, and morale. Families clung to fragile threads of hope, only to watch them unravel. For Karen Miller, the emotional toll grew unbearable. Each call from police raised her expectations, only to shatter them days later. Her children saw the disappointment etch deeper lines in her face. Within the department, frustration mounted. Mark Jensen often slammed files shut in anger, muttering about wasted time. Lisa Rodriguez admitted privately that she felt like they were chasing shadows. The small-town force, already stretched thin, began to feel the grind of long nights and endless paperwork with nothing concrete to show. And still, the question loomed larger with every cleared suspect. If not the drifter, if not the rival mechanic, if not a self-imposed disappearance, then who? The mystery deepened, and the silence around David Miller's vanishing grew heavier with each passing day. By the summer of 1999, the investigation into David Miller's disappearance had lost its momentum. Leads that once seemed urgent were now buried in thick case files. The desk once covered with maps and photographs sat collecting dust in the sheriff's office. Detectives Mark Jensen and Lisa Rodriguez, who had poured countless hours into the search, were reassigned to new cases. The silence around David's name was more deafening than any rumor. The central problem remained. No body, no forensic evidence, no confession. Without those pieces, prosecutors could not move forward, and detectives had nowhere to push. In the language of law enforcement, the case was now labeled cold for the Miller family. However, it was anything but. Karen Miller refused to let her husband's memory be shelved. She traveled across Nebraska, pinning missing posters on gas station doors, rest stops, and grocery store bulletin boards. Her voice, steady in public, cracked behind closed doors. She told anyone who would listen that David had not left by choice. Her words carried both strength and exhaustion, as though she was speaking not only to the public but to herself, convincing her own heart to keep believing. For Ethan and Claire, the years became heavy shadows. Ethan, once a lively teenager, grew distant and guarded. He turned 16 without his father by his side, staring at the empty seat during his driving test. Claire poured her feelings into journals, writing letters addressed to Dad that she hid in shoe boxes under her bed. They marked milestones not with celebrations, but with aching reminders of absence. In the town, life pressed forward, but with a muted edge. Farmers who once gathered in David's shop for help with stubborn engines now turned to other mechanics, though none filled the space he left. His name was spoken less often in public, yet lingered in quiet conversations after church services or during late-night coffee at the diner. Each person carried a memory, his steady hands fixing a tractor, his easy laugh while sharing stories. But those memories grew softer with time. Detectives Jensen and Rodriguez did not forget either. Mark kept a photograph of David in his office drawer, glancing at it when other cases weighed on him. Lisa often found herself replaying the night of October 12th in her mind, wondering what detail they had overlooked. Yet professional duty pulled them to fresher crimes, leaving the Miller case frozen in its unanswered questions. As years slipped into a decade, the file remained untouched in the evidence room, its manila folder growing brittle with age. For the Miller family, time did not heal. It only stretched the wound wider. Karen watched her children step into adulthood without the father who should have guided them. Each holiday carried an empty chair at the table, a silence that settled heavier than words could hold. Hope dimmed, but never vanished. Beneath the weight of years, the question remained unrelenting. Where was David Miller? And would the truth ever rise from the silence that buried him? By 2022, the case of David Miller had become a faded memory to most in rural Nebraska. Nearly 25 years had passed since that October night, and the town had changed with time. Old barns had collapsed, new families had moved in, and children who once rode their bikes past David's garage were now adults raising their own kids. Yet inside Nebraska State Crime Lab, a box labeled Miller David, 1998 sat waiting, its evidence sealed and preserved. The push for re-examination came as part of a statewide initiative. Advances in forensic science had made it possible to revisit old cases, giving long-dormant files another chance at resolution. Among the evidence collected in 1998 was a cigarette, but found near the side door of David's repair shop. At the time, investigators logged it, but had no ability to test it for meaningful DNA. In 2022, however, new technology offered possibilities that were unimaginable back then. A young forensic analyst named Jenna Morris carefully unsealed the evidence bag. The cigarette was brittle, yellow with age, but still usable. She extracted what she could, feeding into machines designed to decode even the smallest fragments of genetic material. Hours passed in silence, broken only by the hum of equipment. Then, as data filled her computer screen, Jenna leaned forward. The profile was strong enough to enter into CODIS, the National DNA Database. When the result returned, the name flashed across the monitor: Robert Hayes. The hit was immediate and startling. Hayes, now in his late 60s, had once lived in the same county. Records showed that he worked alongside David briefly during the early 1990s, helping with farm equipment repairs when business grew busy. But Hayes was also known to law enforcement for another reason. He had a violent history. Assault charges, bar fights, and a reputation for short temper had shadowed his name. Detectives from the cold case unit called Mark Jensen, now retired but still living in Nebraska. When he heard the name, his silence stretched across the line. Robert Hayes, he repeated slowly, as if pulling the memory out of fog. He remembered interviewing Hayes briefly in 1998, but found nothing solid to connect him at the time. There had been no witnesses, no physical evidence to hold him. But the cigarette butt, ignored for decades, now changed everything. While the DNA hit alone was powerful, another twist arrived almost simultaneously. A retired farmer named Thomas Riley, who had lived down the road from David in 1998, contacted authorities after seeing a local news piece about cold cases being reopened. His voice shook as he explained that he had overheard Ray's voices near David's garage on the night of October 12th. At the time, he dismissed it as nothing unusual. Arguments in small towns happen often, and people tended to mind their own business. But as the years wore on, guilt gnawed at him. He could no longer ignore what he had heard. Detectives listened closely. Riley described hearing David's steady voice, calm but firm, followed by another man shouting angrily. He could not see who it was, but he remembered distinct rasp in the voice, a tone he later realized matched Robert Hayes. The convergence of evidence sent a ripple of urgency through the department. Two pieces of information, separated by nearly 25 years, suddenly pointed to the same man. The cigarette butt, carrying DNA, and the neighbor's testimony, carrying memory, merged like puzzle pieces falling into place. Detective Lisa Rodriguez, now a seasoned veteran, described a moment she learned of the DNA match. "It felt like time stopped," she later told reporters. "All those nights, all those unanswered questions, we finally had something concrete." For Karen Miller, the news arrived with trembling hands. When officers knocked on her door to update her, she braced herself as she had done for decades, expecting disappointment. Instead, they spoke Robert Hayes' name. Tears welled in her eyes. For years she had prayed for even the smallest clue, and now technology had breathed life into silence. The town, too, stirred with renewed energy. Conversations returned to the old case, neighbors remembering details they had long tucked away. The name Robert Hayes spread quickly, bringing with it questions of how a man they had once overlooked could have been tied to David's fate all along. Inside the department, the breakthrough was not seen as closure, but as a new beginning. Files were reopened, interviews scheduled, and detectives prepared to confront a suspect who had lived free for more than 2 decades. The sense of urgency was stronger than ever, as if the years of waiting demanded swift action now. What lay ahead was uncertain, but one truth was undeniable. The silence had been broken. After 24 years of shadows, the case of David Miller finally had a path forward. And it all began with a single cigarette, but that refused to stay forgotten. The DNA match to Robert Hayes marked a turning point. But breakthroughs alone do not solve cases. They need someone willing to chase the threads, pull at them until they reveal the full picture. That task fell to Detective Amy Caldwell, a member of Nebraska's cold case unit. Caldwell had built a reputation across the state as relentless. Colleagues described her as sharp-eyed, patient, and unwilling to accept loose ends. When the Miller file landed on her desk in 2022, she treated it not as an old case, but as a personal mission. Caldwell began by immersing herself in the original files. She spread photographs, witness statements, and handwritten notes across her office walls until they formed a timeline. Every page was reviewed, cross-referenced, and marked with colored tabs. She studied the photographs of David's garage, noting the overturned chair, the ripped phone cord, the scattered tools. To her, the scene spoke of sudden rage, not a calculated disappearance. Her next step was re-interviewing witnesses who had spoken to detectives in 1998. Many were older now, their memories softened by time, but Caldwell pressed gently, asking them to recall small details they might have overlooked. Some remembered the chill in the air that night, others the uneasy silence that followed David's disappearance. And when she sat down with Thomas Riley, the retired farmer who had come forward about overhearing an argument, she leaned in closely, listening to his every word. His account of the raspy voice echoing through the dark carried weight. Caldwell knew voices linger in memory, even when faces fade. Still, Caldwell wanted more than memories. She tracked down Robert Hayes' employment history, piecing together where he had worked and lived in 1998. In the files, she found notes indicating Hayes had briefly been on David's payroll. The arrangement had ended abruptly, and there was mention of unpaid wages. Caldwell dug deeper, uncovering court documents showing Hayes had sued another employer years later over similar disputes. A pattern emerged. Hayes held grudges, especially when money and pride were at stake. Neighbors from the 1990s painted a clearer picture. Hayes had been jealous of David's success. While Hayes' own repair job was sporadic and often sloppy, David's garage had thrived. Farmers trusted David's steady work, leaving Hayes in the shadow. Caldwell pieced together the resentment, imagining how the animosity might have festered into something darker. Her days stretched into long nights, the office light glowing while others had gone home. She walked through David's last known steps again and again, closing his shop, the argument outside, the scattered signs of struggle. Caldwell kept a map on her wall, marking Hayes' known movements in 1998. Each line, each note, tightened the circle. She was convinced that Hayes had confronted David that night, anger boiling over unpaid wages and wounded pride. For Caldwell, it was not just about evidence. It was about giving David Miller back his dignity. Too many years had passed with his name buried under dust. Each time she thought of Karen Miller, still waiting for answers, and of Ethan and Claire, who had grown up in the shadow of uncertainty. Her determination sharpened. She refused to let this case fade again. As the weeks turned into months, her obsession grew. She kept Hayes' photograph pinned above her desk, staring at his eyes, wondering what secrets they held. She knew the DNA placed him at the scene. She knew the motive lingered in his resentment. What she needed now was a confession, or enough circumstantial evidence to bring the man into court. Every late-night note, every reread statement, every reconstructed step of October 12, 1998, brought her closer. The walls of her office became a map of obsession, each detail pointing toward Robert Hayes. The case was no longer cold. The pieces were aligning, and Caldwell was preparing for the inevitable, a confrontation with the man she believed had taken David Miller's life. The small, windowless interrogation room smelled faintly of disinfectant. A ticking wall clock filled the silence with steady rhythm, each second heightening the tension. Robert Hayes sat across from Detectives Amy Caldwell and Mark Jensen, his posture relaxed at first, his hands resting on the metal table. He had been here before for questioning and other matters, but this time was different. This time, the evidence had a voice, and it was speaking against him. Detective Caldwell began with polite, almost casual questions. She asked about his time working alongside David Miller in the late 1990s, about what he remembered of those years. Hayes answered smoothly, recalling vague details, shrugging at moments he claimed he could not remember. He leaned back in his chair, trying to project confidence. Then Caldwell shifted the subject. She placed a clear evidence bag on the table. Inside it was a cigarette, but carefully sealed, the one recovered near David's shop nearly 25 years earlier. Hayes' eyes flickered toward it, then quickly back to the detectives. Caldwell's voice was calm but firm as she explained how new DNA testing had matched the cigarette to him. The room seemed to change in that instant. The hum of the fluorescent light grew louder, the tick of the clock sharper. Hayes' body language stiffened. He crossed his arms, leaned forward defensively. "That proves nothing," he muttered, his voice suddenly lower, rougher. Detective Jensen leaned in. "It proves you were there, Robert, on the night David disappeared. You never told us that before." Hayes shifted uncomfortably. He denied it again, raising his voice this time, insisting he'd stop by on another day. But his words did not carry conviction. Caldwell pressed further, reminding him of witnesses who recalled tension between him and David, disputes over money, resentment that had lingered long after Hayes left the shop. Minute by minute, the calm facade he entered with began to crumble. Sweat formed on his forehead. His hands gripped tighter on the edge of the table. Caldwell noticed a subtle shift, his breathing heavier, his gaze avoiding hers. She leaned closer, her voice steady but relentless. "Robert, this is your chance. David's family has lived in torment for 24 years. His children grew up not knowing what happened to their father. If you have anything left in you, any piece of humanity, now is the time to speak." The silence stretched long, broken only by the ticking clock. Hayes' jaw worked as though he were grinding his teeth. Finally, he exhaled a heavy breath, his shoulders slumping. His voice cracked when he spoke. "I did not mean for it to happen like that," he said softly. Caldwell's heart raced, though her expression remained composed. She asked him to explain. Hayes stared down at the table, unable to meet their eyes. He told them how he'd gone to David's shop that night, furious over wages he believed were unfairly withheld. He admitted he had been drinking, his anger boiling over. The two argued loudly, their voices echoing in the quiet workshop. In the heat of the moment, Hayes grabbed a wrench from the workbench and struck David across the head. The sound of the blow silenced the argument forever. Hayes' voice trembled as he described the shock, the panic that followed. Realizing what he had done, he wrapped David's body in a tarp and drove out to a remote field outside town. There, under the covered darkness, He buried him shallowly, believing the earth and time would keep his secret. Detective Jensen closed his eyes briefly as the weight of the confession sank in. Caldwell wrote every detail, her pen scratching the paper as Hayes' words spilled out. The decades of unanswered questions, of speculation and pain, were finally crystallizing into truth. When Hayes finished, the room fell into heavy silence. He sat motionless, his face pale, his hands trembling slightly. For the first time that day, he looked small, stripped of the arrogance he carried in with him. Caldwell rose slowly, gathering the evidence bag from the table. Her voice was steady, almost quiet. "Thank you for telling the truth, Robert. It is too late for David, but not too late for his family to finally know." As officers escorted him from the room, the truth settled in like a storm finally breaking. The mystery that haunted a town for nearly a quarter of a century had a face, a voice, and now, a confession. For Karen Miller and her children, the answers came with grief, relief, and rage intertwined. But above all, it ended the silence. David Miller's story, once lost in the shadows of rumor and uncertainty, had finally been told. When Robert Hayes was formally charged with the murder of David Miller, the news rippled through Nebraska like a shockwave. For years, the case had lingered as little more than a ghost story whispered in diners and church basements. Many had quietly assumed it would remain unsolved forever. Now, suddenly, the truth had a name, a face, and a courtroom in which to be judged. Local newspapers carried bold headlines, while radio stations replayed the announcement throughout the day. In small towns across the state, people who had once brought their tractors and trucks to David's shop paused to take in the update. Some expressed quiet relief that justice was finally at hand, while others admitted sorrow. Sorrow that the answer had come only after decades of waiting. For Karen Miller and her children, now adults with families of their own, the first hearing was especially difficult. Walking into the courthouse, Karen clutched a photo of David, her hand trembling, but her expression resolute. Ethan, once the boy who skipped school in grief, now stood as a protective presence beside her. Claire, who had written letters to her missing father as a child, carried those folded papers in her purse, a private reminder of her long journey. When Hayes was escorted into the courtroom, the family finally faced him. The man who had once been little more than a rumor in their nightmares now stood in chains, no longer able to hide. Karen's eyes never left him. She later told reporters she wanted Hayes to know that David was more than a paycheck, more than an argument. He was a husband, a father, a friend whose absence had carved holes into countless lives. The trial became a sensation in the community. Farmers and townsfolk filled the gallery, eager for every update. Some remembered their last conversations with David. Others spoke of the emptiness his garage had left. Though painful, the proceedings forced the town to reckon with the shadows of its past. For the first time, closure seemed within reach. Justice, though delayed, was finally walking to the doors of the same courthouse where people had once despaired of ever finding answers. The story of David Miller was no longer unfinished. The silence of 24 years had broken, replaced by voices demanding accountability, healing, and the dignity of truth. Karen Miller often says the hardest part was not the grief, but the silence. For more than 2 decades, she lived with questions that never seemed to end. When the truth finally emerged, it did not erase the pain, but it gave her something solid to hold. An answer, however bitter. "At least now," she told reporters, "we know what happened. At least now my children can stop wondering." Detectives who worked the case reflect on the lesson it carried. Science again a voice to evidence that once seemed useless. A cigarette butt, a memory overlooked, a file gathering dust. Together, they became the thread that unraveled a lie kept hidden for 24 years. The community, too, felt the weight of the resolution. One man's rage had shattered a family and unsettled an entire town. Yet the persistence of investigators and the strength of those left behind had ensured that silence did not win. Cold cases remind us that justice does not fade with time. They wait, patient and unresolved, until someone refuses to stop searching. David Miller's story stands as a testament to resilience, truth, and an enduring fight for answers.